thank you for the privilege to be here today. It was always going to be a privilege to deliver this lecture for many reasons. The first one being that I have admired and been inspired by Nadine Gordimer since my student days. To me, she was exemplary, or the epitome of somebody who had transcended the notion of justice as just us and operated in the realm of justice for all, and more importantly, in seeing everything as being about justice. The other thing we share is that Judge Bezos adored her and really would have loved to be part of this lecture tonight, which saddens me that he's not able to join us. But I do believe that wherever he is, if he can see us, he's happy that it has finally happened, and that there's a good reason it had to happen this year instead of when it was planned to happen. Of course, he was a contemporary of Madiba, whom we all adore, not necessarily because he was the first president in democratic South Africa, because he was another human being who transcended the notion of justice as just me, or just us, or just for people like me. He understood justice to be the basis of all human relationships, and ultimately the basis of a peaceful society. The lecture is appropriately titled Nadine Gordimer, the audacity to speak an inconvenient truth. Sorry. George Orwell, who is an acclaimed author, once said, "In time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." Then me and you, when we think of someone like Nadine Gordimer, we don't think of her as a revolutionary. Yet her literature and that of others like her who questioned the ordering of the day moved the needle with regard to justice for many groups in society, and certainly in this country, with regard to justice for Black people in their different shades. Her good company includes authors such as Alex Leguma, Andre Brink, Charles Bosman, Olive Schreiner, Chinua Achebe, and some that she herself considered her contemporaries, people like Net Nakasa and his contemporaries. Although she was a writer and used her words to shift consciousness in society, there are others who used words too to shift consciousness in society. For example, George Bezos, as a lawyer, spoke truth to power. And in so doing, like Nadine Gordimer, shed light on inconvenient truths. Charlotte McClage, who died when Nadine Gordimer was still a child, was another who used her voice and her words to alert us to injustices and to the possibility of a better world, a better society where the humanity of everyone was embraced. Pixley Kayisa Kase, another lawyer who also used the power of words to shift consciousness in society. And of course, you've already heard about Mandela. But when you think about speaking inconvenient truths and facing the consequences of being ostracized in many quarters for doing so, it is worth remembering that Ben Turok too, who was a child of Jewish immigrants like Nadine Gordimer, also chose to speak truth to power, or to speak inconvenient truth, and of course, faced the consequences. I'll speak a little bit later about Nadine's approach to the truth and why it is relevant to South Africa today. But as we reflect on the audacity of Nadine Gordimer and others to speak the inconvenient truth, we challenged to reflect on the inconvenient truths that need to be spoken to shift the justice needle of our time. What are those unpleasant truths? Many in this room and elsewhere would say corruption in state affairs, particularly among public leaders. Others would add that in the light of what happened at Steiner and VBS Bank, corruption in the public sector should be dealt with, but so should corruption in the private sector. Others would even add the bread scandal and say that too was a form of corruption, and so was the collusion in respect of the building of stadiums during 2010. But many colleagues in this room and elsewhere will go further to say, to save democracy, we need to double up our anti-corruption efforts, particularly corruption in law enforcement. We also need to make sure that in law enforcement, nobody escapes the rule of law. I want you to reflect though, is this all? Are these the only inconvenient truths of our time? Corruption, good governance, particularly clean governance, and the rule of law, particularly making sure that no one escapes accountability for their wrongdoing. Of course, you would say, no, I've omitted something, which is state capture. That too should be taken care of because it is impacting on democracy. For those who don't know, state capture is defined by the World Bank, involves a certain group in private society capturing portions of the state and repurposing those portions of the state for policy decisions, procurement, and related decisions that favor their business interests. It also includes capturing and repurposing law enforcement agencies to make sure that there is no accountability for corruption in terms of policy perversion and the perversion of state procurement systems. And of course, there's a state capture commission that is dealing with that. The lecture, on the other hand, argues that an all hands on deck war against corruption is a must. What I would like to ask you is, can we win that war if it is divorced from an all-out war on social justice? And in so doing, I would like us to distill the essence of Nadine Gordimer. Did she just speak inconvenient truths? Or was there a recurring theme in those truths? In her Nobel acceptance speech, she speaks about justice, quoting some of the writers like herself, including Albert Camus in this regard. In this paper, I will posit that the challenges that Nadine and her contemporaries faced as privileged South Africans are now our challenges. And it's the challenge of being privileged in a society that is anchored in underprivilege. What duty do you have? She was of Jewish descent in a country, though, where whiteness was everything. Yes, of course, within shades of whiteness, the Jewish community was not treated properly. But when it came to the ordering of humanity under apartheid, she was treated better. She even speaks about the fact that she was able to write her first book at the age of 15 and have it published. She also talks about the fact that she was able to study in a school, at a library, and how she discovered that Black kids were not allowed even that. So in other words, even though you may have been poor as a white person and therefore underprivileged in the social structure that you were part of, you still were privileged in relation to race. Let's look at 27 years into democracy and 25 years into implementing our globally celebrated transformative constitution. What, in your views, are the inconvenient truths of our time? Nadine didn't see herself as just a writer. She saw her work as a handheld torch to communicate to others. I liked that, her seeing herself as a handheld torch, which is a small torch, but nonetheless powerful against darkness. She chronicled, as we've heard, apartheid and how it affected everyday justice, or as it was an order of everyday injustice if you happen to be Black. Mind you, she was Jewish, she was white, but she chose to concern herself about the most underprivileged in the society she lived in. And of course, we know now that she received a Nobel Literature Prize in 1991. In her Nobel lecture in 1991, she said the following, which gives us an idea into what she regarded as the most pressing challenges for writers of her time. Open quotes. The writer is of service to humankind only insofar as the writer uses the word even against his or her own loyalties. Trusts. The state of being as it is revealed to hold somewhere in its complexity filaments of the code of truth, able to be bound together here and there in art. Trust the state of being to yield somewhere fragmentary phrases of truth, which is the final word of words, never changed by our stumbling efforts to spell it out and write it down, never changed by lies, by semantic sophistry, by the dating of the word for the purposes of racism, sexism, prejudice, domination, the glorification of destruction, the curses, and the praise songs. From the same speech, we get a sense that Nadine Gordimer's own take on her audacity to speak the inconvenient truth when she says the following, open quotes again. For this aesthetic venture of ours becomes subversive when the shameful secrets of our time are explored deeply, with the artist's rebellious integrity to the state of being manifest in life around her or him. Then the writer's themes and characters inevitably are formed by the pressures and distortions of that society, as the life of the fisherman is determined by the power of the sea. There is a paradox, she says. In retaining this integrity, the writer sometimes must risk both the state's indictment of treason and the liberation forces' complaint of lack of blind commitment. And when I think about that, I think about where we are. I think about my own life. Born into poverty, privileged through people who paid for my education from grade 11 onwards, and an opportunity given to me to be part of conceiving the new society through the Constitution and the laws that followed. And again, privileged to be one of those that have received the low-lying fruits of democracy. Hence, I'm here able to speak to you on a computer when others are left behind. They can't do Zoom. Even when schools went online, they couldn't come online with us. Even when commerce went online, they couldn't go online. And governance, including access to vaccines, went online. Some couldn't do all of that. And I'm able to do all of that and even have change that I can share with students under Action for Inclusion and support many others through education and other needs in life. But what does that mean? Does that mean I should be silent about some of the excesses of our time? Or, like Nadine, must I consider the moonshot, which is the South Africa we sought to build when we accepted the interim constitution in 1993 and the final constitution we have now in 1996. And the final constitution talks about adopting this constitution as a basis for healing the divisions of the past and establishing a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. So what inconvenient truths does that throw to me, you, and others who have an opportunity to use their words as a handheld torch to shine some light on realities that shouldn't be there, but they are there, on realities that need to be fixed, but they're not being fixed, or at least they're not being fixed satisfactorily. Nadine continues to say the following. To paraphrase coarsely, Marquez's dictum given by him both as a writer and a fighter for justice, the writer must take the right to explore what's and all, both the enemy and the beloved comrade in arms, since only a try for the truth make sense of being. Only a try for the truth edges towards justice, just ahead of youth's first slouching to be born in literature from life. So when I started, I asked, what inconvenient truths are part of our challenge as we take the baton from Nadine Gordimer, George Bezos, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Helen Suzman, Ben Turok, the Sisulus, Albertina Sisulu, and Tata Sisulu, Walter Sisulu. As we take the baton from them, what are the challenges of our time? You will agree with me that saving democracy should be at the forefront of that. And of course, linked to that is the rule of law and integrity in state affairs. And you will agree with me that corruption must go, and wherever it rears its ugly head, it must be hit with the full force of the law and the contempt of our society. Because if there ever was a poison that poisons everything in society, it is corruption. It poisons justice, it poisons social justice, it poisons social cohesion. It just undermines a functional and sustainable society. And corruption, of course, as I understand it, is the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. Because in the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act of South Africa, it's defined much more elaborately. But at the core of that is the abuse of entrusted power for gratification. And it's a crime that is committed by both the person who abuses power for gratification and the one who induces someone to abuse their power dishonestly for gratification, to benefit someone in order that they may get gratification. Then there's the issue of the rule of law, which has become a concern with others attacking our courts instead of subjecting themselves, as Nelson Mandela did, to the rule of law. Nelson Mandela, in defense of the public protector and the Constitutional Court, reminded us that even the most benevolent of governments have within them persons with propensities for human failings, and that was why the architecture of South Africa's democracy included a polycentric accountability system. And he indicated that that system includes Chapter 9 institutions such as the Public Protector and the Auditor General, and innovative new institutions such as the Constitutional Court. And he said it was important for them that when people's rights are violated, people would not find themselves without a remedy. And hence, these additional innovative structures were included. And he said it never occurred to him that he should treat these institutions as an irritation. Talking about the Public Protector, the Constitutional Court, and all of these innovative institutions. He said when these institutions held him accountable, he saw that as evidence of the fact that the people of South Africa will never find themselves with a situation where they are ruled instead of governed, and there's no remedy for the transgression of their rights. And of course, therefore, protecting the rule of law should be paramount. And what about corruption? I've already said that that's crucial too. State capture, that's crucial. But the question for me is that all? Oh, that's not all. I've already said that one of the inconvenient truths of our time is the need to save democracy. And for me, that is beyond getting, for example, President Zuma to obey the law. It is also about how we handle challenges such as COVID-19 in such a way that we do not gravitate towards an authoritarian state, that we continue in all of these circumstances to stick to the vision in the Constitution, which is to establish a society that is founded on three fundamental pillars, being democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Why is democracy worth saving? I would say you would agree with me that although democracy might be an imperfect way of regulating the affairs of a country or group, it is the best system that we know. And I also would like us to understand that democracy does not have a fixed way of articulation. If you pause for a moment, most of the people in this room are writers, and some of them, you draw your inspiration from history, and you think about 5th century Athens, you'll agree with me that democracy as understood by Athenians in the 5th century is nothing compared to what we have today. And people would even say that even before Athenian democracy, there was democracy in this continent. The very fact that a chief would sit with people in a kraal and canvass everyone's opinion before a decision was made, that was democracy. The very fact that somebody who was a crier went around calling everyone to make sure that nobody is left behind in terms of decisions, that was democracy. And of course, in the fact that everyone's view was canvassed before a final decision was made, that was democracy. So we must see democracy as a concept that has plasticity, that can be shaped and implemented according to the changes in society. Hence, I have met several young people that say we don't want democracy. Our parents fought for freedom, and we got democracy, which keeps us in similar shackles as the ones we had under apartheid, which takes me to what I personally think was the essence of Nadine Gordimer's message. And I think at the core of her messaging was social justice. In her Nobel acceptance speech, she said the following: "Only many years later was I to realize that if I had been a Black, I might not have become a writer at all, since the library that made this possible for me was not open to any Black child." So that's very clear that she felt she was privileged and that it wasn't right to live in a society where you were privileged on account of your skin. For me, that's an issue of social justice. And you will say there's different conceptions of social justice, and I would agree with you. Since Jesuit philosopher Luigi Taparelli Diazeglio coined the concept of social justice in 1843, there's been differences in how we conceptualize it. John Rawls in the 20th century saw it as essentially about economic fairness. Fairness in that the benefits and burdens of a society, when it comes to economic opportunities, we're supposed to be evenly spread. But for me, I draw inspiration for what social justice is from our constitutional court, particularly the Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden. And I will say that at the social justice chair, we view social justice as essentially about equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms reflected in the just, fair, and equitable distribution of all opportunities, resources, privileges, benefits, and burdens in a society or group and between societies. And why is social justice important? We go back to John Rawls in his seminal paper, A Theory of Justice in 1971. He said the following: in the absence of a certain measure of agreement on what is just and unjust, it is clearly more difficult for individuals to coordinate their plans efficiently in order to ensure that mutually beneficial arrangements are maintained. Distrust and resentment corrode the ties of civility and suspicion, and hostility tempt men to act in ways they would otherwise avoid. So while the distinctive role of conceptions of justice is to specify rights and duties and to determine the appropriate distributive shares, the way in which a conception does this is bound to affect the problems of efficiency, coordination, and stability. And we agree with Rawls at the Social Justice Chair that it is important that as South Africans, we need to achieve, as Justice Kriegler says, sufficient consensus. Well, he wasn't talking about social justice, but he said it's important at this stage as a society to achieve sufficient consensus. And why I came to Stellenbosch, I felt as a public protector that our efforts at rooting out corruption, dishonesty, and unethical conduct in state affairs were going to be frustrated if the majority of the people are not on our side because they don't see any value in clean governance if it's not going to transform their lives. So during Nadine Gordimer's time, the challenge of social injustice was that certain groups in society were excluded from opportunities, from resources, from privileges and benefits, and on them were imposed higher burdens. For example, the Group Areas Act, land disposition laws, master and servant laws, and various laws that excluded people from opportunity, did not allow Black people, for example, to be managers. But in addition to that, forced removals meant land taken away from them. My father is one example. In Dachakral, they suffered that. And when they had land in Joburg in a place called Albertine, they suffered the same fate. And when there was some kind of compensation, it was being given a 4-roomed house, which was not the same size as the house you had. But what people also fail to understand is that the ecosystem that people heard, the ecosystem that had produced entrepreneurs such as Charlotte Maxeke, Pixley Kaseme, and many others, was destroyed when these people were removed and put in these new places. So it wasn't enough that they were given those 4-roomed houses, but also the right to own property and the right to trade freely was taken away. And all of that has now gone away. What then is the inconvenient truth of our time? For me, it is us finding consensus or sufficient consensus on what do we regard as social justice. Do we all agree that the Constitution is a transformative constitution? And therefore, as the Constitutional Court has said in cases such as S versus Makwanyane, Minister of Finance versus Van Heeren, etc., that it is a transformative constitution and its implementation requires transformative constitutionalism. In other words, we are supposed to use it as a basis for transforming the social relations we inherited from apartheid that distinguished people on the basis of color, on the basis of sex, and on the basis of nationality, religion, etc., and underprivilege them on that basis. And we're supposed to look at what was the consequence of that. There are those who believe, let's leave the past where it belongs. In other words, we are equal now. After adopting the magic word, which was our Constitution, we are now equal. And let everyone be treated the same and an anti-discrimination regime is sufficient. That was what we were faced with in Parliament when we pushed for the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. There were those who fought very hard not to have the restitutive part of the act, the one with remedial and restitutive measures. And guess what? The fight was moved from Parliament to Treasury, and the implementation of the restitutive part of the act was stopped until now. As we speak, there's an act in Parliament that is only now, 27 years into democracy and 21 years since the act was passed, trying to implement the advancement of equality part of the act. But in Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden, there's two things that I find interesting. One is parliamentarians found it easy to pass a law for their own restitution. And when Van Heerden complained about this, they fought this matter and won. But when the Equality Act, the promotion part of the Equality Act, was challenged by civil servants in government from the previous order, there wasn't enough of a fight by politicians, not even after the Human Rights Commission wrote to government saying it was improper and unconstitutional not to implement a law that had been passed. This continued. So what has been the effect of that? The effect, as Steve Biko said, was that if after democracy, all we implement is anti-discrimination measures, we will cement the unequal power relations that were created during apartheid. And I think that has happened, unintentionally, but it has happened. Justice Ngobo in Batu Star Fishing Company versus the Minister of Environmental Affairs and Tourism says the following: in this fundamental way, our constitution differs from other constitutions, which assume that all are equal, and in so doing, simply entrench existing inequalities. Our constitution recognizes the decades of systemic racial discrimination entrenched by the apartheid legal order cannot be eliminated without positive measures. Without positive action being taken to achieve that result. We are required to do more than that. The effects of discrimination may continue indefinitely unless there is a commitment to end that. Kara Asman, in a conference held in 1991, had said the same. The question, therefore, that we all have to ask ourselves as we reflect on this great life of Nadine Gordimer, whose notion of justice transcended justice as just us or justice for people like me, whose notion of justice was a notion of justice about leaving no one behind. What should be done about justice today? What are the inconvenient truths? I believe that the inconvenient truths include corruption by anyone, including people who are our friends. And I was confronted with that when I had to deal with the Ngandla and the state capture investigation. But the people whose actions I had to question are people who considered themselves my people. And I'm using that term, my people, because somebody, when I tweeted yesterday, said to me, you have no right to talk about a good life or about people pursuing a good life for themselves because you sold your people. You destroyed your people. And I wondered why this person says my people. Who are my people? You Wits people, for example, are my people because I am a Wits alumni. The Stellenbosch people are my people. The people of Soweto are my people. Women are my people. People of South Africa, people of Africa, we have multiple identities. And that's what Nadine Gordimer understood, that we have multiple identities, but what binds our humanity is the truth as we understand it. Hers was to speak the truth as she understood it, and she also understood that that was one version of the truth. So what is the challenge for me and you is, how do we speak the truth, even if it's inconvenient? How do we make sure that we don't stay for another 27 years of democracy, whilst having some of our people feeling that democracy is not working for them, and then having those people willing to undo democracy because they don't think it works for them? There is a glimmer of hope, though. I see things turning around in the country and everywhere in the world. And I see people like you in this room being those torches that Nadine Gordimer saw her work as. And I do believe that light is stronger than darkness, even if it's a very small light. But I also believe, as Ethiopians do, that unity in action makes the greatest of difference. When one light may be strong against darkness, a galaxy of lights combined together are formidable against darkness. Thank you for the privilege to honor this great South African and great soul that walked among us. Thank you. Blessings.
Thank you, Dr. Madonsela. Thank you, Professor Madonsela. There are nearly 350 participants who are here to hear you speak, and many of them have questions for you. They've been putting questions in. We've received questions on email, but I thought as your intermediary to relay questions to you and conduct a conversation between you and all of the people who are watching, I would start with a very hard-hitting question, which is certainly something that's on my mind. I think it's on the minds of anybody who watched Whispering Truth to Power, which is that we are all in a pandemic to different degrees. I'm speaking to you from Bangalore in India, a country in which our institutions have been so eroded in terms of exactly the kinds of things you've been speaking about and working on for most of your life, that it's very difficult to see a figure such as yourself emerging in this country and being able to thrive in the way that you do. It's admirable. And so for people like us, I think, who are not from South Africa, there is something really wonderful about your existence in the country and your ability to continue to do what you do. We admire you for it very much. It is, however, a pandemic in which our own government in India's ability is being tested severely. We have a staggering crisis, but you have a crisis as well. And in times of crisis, we remember our loved ones and our families. And so my hard-hitting question to you, Professor Madonsela, is how are your wonderful children? They were great in the film. They were amazing. They were really nice to watch. So interesting. How are they doing? How are you doing?
Oh my good Lord, thank you. Thank you, dear colleague. My children are doing very well. They are grown people at this stage. My son is 32. My daughter is 29. And they've done well. My days as a pup protector were very trying for them. And because it was a case of being parachuted to this post, nothing prepared them for it. It's not the same thing as starting as a magistrate and then a senior judge, and then you are at the top of the pinnacle. And therefore they did struggle a bit during the term, but mostly after the term, they have struggled with some of these issues, but they have overcome these battles, and I'm happy to see them reclaiming their happiness every day of their lives.
That's
And
wonderful.
they now, sorry, there also is a granddaughter now for my daughter. Her name is Melokohle, the one who stands for what's right. And we've written a book for Melo's generation to teach them about the values that I was raised with through proverbs, African proverbs and fables. So it's Melo's Kingdom, which in honor of my grandchild.
Oh, we shall look out for it. That's wonderful. Congratulations. Congratulations. We have questions that came in on email. So now we'll go to the softer questions, right? Because these are the ones that came in on email. And the first soft question to you is, given the need for constitutionally compliant anti-corruption machinery of state to bring looters to book and to recover the loot, what do you regard as the way forward with the reform of the structure and operations of the criminal justice administration? And this question is from Paul Hoffman from Accountability Now.
Thank you, sir. It sounds, if it's Paul Hoffman, it might be the Paul Hoffman from our country who gave us a whole lot of investigations, including the lifeboat investigation. And my response is that if we are going to move the needle in terms of making our democracy work better, work for everyone and work sustainably, we will have to bring back the people into the party. Democracy is two Greek words, demos, kratos. We need the people to be part of it. And I think I like Nancy Fraser's approach to justice, which has elements of representation, recognition, and restitution. And I think that the representation is extremely important. And I worry, for example, that with COVID-19, that's being eroded unintentionally, but tendencies may creep that exclude the people from the formulation of policies. For example, the Equality Act is going through now. The average Gogo Dlamini who will be impacted by this act doesn't even know because it's all happening online. And so I do think that us as civil society, we have to make sure we wake up the giants in our people so that they don't just protect democracy when people are defying institutions of government. On an everyday basis, they know how democracy works and they play their part. And more importantly, they elect the right people into office.
Thank you. This is a question from one of the attendees at this seminar. And the question is, speaking the inconvenient truth is often viewed as being unpatriotic, in some quarters at least. Others have been labeled as whistleblowers for speaking the inconvenient truth and find themselves chastised for it. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you for bringing that. As I was worried about time, I jumped the reference to whistleblowers. Absolutely. Whistleblowers are seen as unpatriotic. And that takes us back to that one paragraph I read from Nadine Gordimer, where it's okay when you complain about the past, but when you start blowing the whistle against people that regard you as one of them, people feel you are betraying them, whereas you're not betraying them. You actually are betraying them when you allow them to erode the truth, when you allow them to allow looting to take place, because when the boat goes down, because democracy was sabotaged, we're all gonna go down. And therefore, really going back to the quote I started with from George Orwell, when I was first introduced to Marxism, we regarded George Orwell as an enemy because we thought he was a traitor and was undermining socialism. But later we all understood that the concept itself made sense, having an egalitarian society, but there was a whole lot of rot there. people were killed, people treated themselves better than others, hence the animal farm approach. And in 2011, I spoke about us becoming an animal farm here in South Africa. And yes, of course, people saw me as a traitor. But think about what has happened. There are some people who think they are above the law and they deserve more, and they also deserve to eat for the people. And if that's the case in India as well, we need to nip it in the bud.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Madonsela. This is an interesting question that's come up, and I think that this is something that comes up actually not just in South Africa, but in India or in the United States. And in fact, today, Facebook announced that their former president, Donald Trump, the United States former president, would not be allowed back on Facebook, but said that it was subject to future review. And there is a question from a member of this seminar who's attending, who says, we should not be offensive for the sake of it, but we should not be afraid to offend, as everybody should have the freedom to challenge, argue against, and disagree with views that they find offensive or disagree with. Otherwise, people will be afraid to say what they really think, and society will be the loser because we will not be able to confront views that are dangerous or wrong. What does Thuli Madonsela think about today's increasing curbs on speech?
Thank you, Say. I honestly think that's a very, very difficult one. And it's something that I personally have been grappling with since my days working at Verted Carols, because one of the papers I read early there from a Canadian judge was words hurt, sometimes worse than swords. And in recent years, and as part of delving into mental health, I've also read a lot about neuroscience, that words can hurt and words can divide. And if words can build, as Nadine Gordimer tells us, we must also understand that words can destroy. Without words, Rwanda would not have heard the genocide that it heard in the 90s. Without words, we would not be speaking about the Holocaust. So the question is really not that we shouldn't curb speech. The question is twofold. It is, where do we draw the line in such a way that in the pretext of protecting people from hate speech, we don't really curb freedom of speech unnecessary. So that's one dimension of this. The second dimension of it is just generally discriminatory speech. What kind of discriminatory speech are we going to sanction? And again, where do we draw the line in such a way that this is not a way of protecting wrongdoers from being brought to, from being questioned? But secondly, this is not a way to stifle debate, because there isn't a single truth. And I think you get that from the essays from Nadine Gordimer and from many writers, that there isn't a single truth. And also what we thought was true yesterday becomes untrue today. If you think about, before Galileo, everyone thought the world was flat. And Galileo came and said the world was not flat, it was spheric. And then we changed with them. So I think we have to allow people to keep moving the needle. I can't tell you for sure right now, where do we draw the line? I do know though that if one child, for example, can beat up another one because on the internet, the other one insulted her, and the one who gets beaten up gets to kill themselves, you can understand that words incited one to beat up, and the one who was beaten up felt that just publishing that she was beaten up had humiliated her enough that her life was now worthless and she killed herself. And that's a real story here in South Africa. Lufuno killed herself under those circumstances. So I want to say, For me, at the Social Justice Chair, we ask people to be impact conscious and say, whenever you're doing something, ask yourself, why are you doing this? And then ask yourself, what's going to be the impact on others? It's almost like the Rotary Club, isn't it? At Tuma Foundation, they talk about it as epic leadership. Is this ethical? What is the purpose? What will be the impact? Is it committed to save the whole of humanity? So I do think that maybe sometimes we have to sanction ourselves. We have to curb ourselves, because we increasingly are creating a cruel society in the name of free speech.
Thank you. I'm going to move along just in the interest of time, because I know that we have only a little more time. So the next question is from also an attendee at this lecture, who says, what would you say to young people who complain that democracy has no benefit for them because they're poor? So much so that some would even prefer a tyrannical government as long as they could be empowered economically.
Thank you. I would say to a young person, you're right that maybe democracy at the moment is not yielding dividends to you. But two things. One is it's the best form of government we've ever had. We haven't invented a better one yet, and therefore we've got to stick with it. But secondly, it's a concept that has plasticity. It's not an elastic concept in that at some stage it will break if you stretch it. Democracy can be molded. As I said, it's not the way it was in 5th century Athens. If you take a country like Rwanda, for example, they have seats on constituency seats, they have PR, and then they have representatives of certain groups that would have ordinarily been excluded. They have reserved. And therefore, young people can insist that there should be some kind of quota for young people to be included in PR elections. And secondly, they should insist that we should have a mixture of PR and constituency, because we've learned here in South Africa that where you have only PR, as in national elections, accountability suffers because people fear their political party and not the people.
Thank you. I think this next question is from your son. At least the name on the Zoom screen is the same name as your son, is Thuli Madonsela. So if it's someone, I'm not sure exactly if it's you. If it is actually you, you were great in the film. And I mean, if it's not, I apologize to you, Professor Madonsela. But the question is, in an effort to address the injustices of the past, do we not create new injustices for those who were previously advantaged and who would not believe they live in a system that works against them? How would you explain to people like this that we are trying to create a just society when they believe they are being discriminated against, whether that is true or not?
Thank you, Mbusovante. That is my son, and his name means democracy, people's government. Right. Mbusovante, thank you. And thank you for asking this question.
On Zoom, so I was just worried. I wasn't sure exactly. So,
incidentally, say, this is something that was in our writings in the 90s, before we had the Constitution and before we had the Employment Equity Act and broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Acts. We had said that to reverse the imbalances of the past, you have to implement remedial and restitutive measures. We also had said that these measures would harm individuals because they are addressing group injustice, but at an individual level, they would be painful. And because they'll be painful at an individual level, we have to handle it with care. And I do think that in the name of remedial and restitutive measures, we have covered things like nepotism, political cronyism, etc., which really has exacerbated the polarization in society. And that's why I do think that going forward, we do need that sufficient consensus, and not among politicians and business, sufficient consensus at societal level. The average person needs to know that when you've had a monopoly game where the blue team and the pink team started well together, and then the pink team was stopped was stopped from playing and their resources taken away. And that ran for 300 rounds, so to speak. And thereafter, when you decided that it was wrong to exclude them, you don't reset the game. You say everyone keeps what they have, but now the pink team can join. No matter how hard the pink team works, it can never cover the ground that it has lost. And therefore you do need some kind of reset. But in real life, you can't reset in that you can't just say everyone starts from zero. You've got to find ways to do things. And that's where I don't think that BEE was the right thing. I think BEE was a lost cause. And for me, I think it's for two reasons why BEE was wrong. One, it's an assimilationist model. Here you have an economy where Blacks were excluded and yet they're the majority. You're talking people who constitute more than 85% of the country. You then say your model is a system where they have to be absorbed into the historically white institutions. Why? It makes sense in the mining industry because you've got limited opportunities for mining. But in the rest of industry, this model was wrong. And all it then did was money available to reindustrialize the country didn't go there because it went into buying shares into these pre-existing companies. But it also meant that then once somebody has been declared BEE compliant, they get tenders in government. And then the small guys, BEE is corrosive to both Black and white small businesses. I think about 2 years ago, I was shocked when I spoke to the Queen of the Royal Bafokeng that they had found themselves being less Black than Anglo-American. They couldn't get the same BE verification as Anglo, and they 100% Black. That is how ridiculous this BEE is, in that everyone is treated the same. And again, for me, it goes to the failure to keep the Constitution as your lodestar. When you pass policies, we say, always keep your Constitution as your lodestar. So every act that you're passing, you've got to ask yourself who will benefit. And we've created a matrix for that. It's called Social Impact Assessment Matrix. It's got 9 indicators. Who will benefit and who will suffer? Because social justice is about making burdens and benefits even. So you always have to ask yourself that in all of the groups in society, who will find it easier, who will find it difficult? And I don't think they did that with BE. And hence, small businesses, particularly from historically advantaged communities, are suffering because these requirements are burdensome. For family businesses, BE is bizarre because you are now forcing a family-owned business to now have artificially a Black partner. And I just think that the model must be discussed. I'm not saying there shouldn't be remedial measures. I'm not saying there shouldn't be restitutive measures. I'm saying the model should be based on what kind of society are you creating. In fact, if anything, BE has reinforced white supremacy, in my view, instead of undermining it. That's my view, Mbusobantu, that yes, we have to think about making sure that we don't reinforce fragility in our state affairs, in our social life, in implementing these measures. But we have to bring everyone to the party to understand that this monopoly game cannot continue as if no injustice happened. And Justice Edwin Cameron in Daniels versus Kribante, which is the land case, agrees. He says, as long as we don't deal with the injustices of the past, justice, the call of justice will continue to haunt us.
Thank you. And also, Mbuso Wamanto, I hope you got all of that, and otherwise your mother will have a word with you. So, all right. I think we're kind of run out of time, but maybe, Bronwyn, with your permission, we can have one last question before handing over to you. Yes, there is one last question, which I think is quite interesting, and the person who asked the question asked quite early, which is that you talked about the inconvenient truths and speaking truths to power and holding those in power accountable. And you confirm the role of the writer in this vital role, and that's the nature of this lecture. That's why we're here. But as an extension of that, what are your views on the role that news media can play in this enterprise of inconvenient truths?
Thank you. What a lovely way to end. The media is about using words. And in our use of words, we can be regressive or we can be progressive. And one of the things I have realized as now a privileged person in society is you can be regressive without wanting to be regressive. If you don't realize your own prejudices, as a heterosexual Black professional woman, I constantly have to ask myself, when I'm dealing with people with disabilities, when I'm dealing with people with the LGBTQI communities, when I'm dealing with non-nationals, am I bringing to bear my own biases? You have to constantly ask yourself, anybody who claims that they are not biased, they have never examined themselves. Neuroscientists tell us that we are what we have consistently seen, what we have consistently heard. And this we learned in sociology as well, agents of socialization. And therefore we're wired to discriminate. We're wired to prefer people like ourselves. We're wired to be homosocial. And I think the media did an excellent job in exposing apartheid injustices. And globally, the media has done an excellent job in exposing injustices, including corruption. WikiLeaks are an example of exposing impropriety. Here in South Africa, Gupta Leaks and others. The media has been amazing. I could never have done my job as a cop protector without the media either exposing, supporting the process, and also providing leads to where the truth might be hiding. But I do want to say the media, which I am a member because I've been a columnist for the last 3 years, I do think we have to also examine our own biases. Who do we believe? Who do we not believe? When, for example, we publish an article, do we think about it when we're going to do headlines or when we're going to do subheadings? I've seen, for example, that there's a girl who got money accidentally from the National Student Fund, NSFAS, and she chowed the money quickly, presumably thought God had given her this windfall, because there are some priests in South Africa that lie to people and say, you'll get money just with no source. So I don't know why she chowed it, but I have found it amazing that every time the story is mentioned, her name and her face is shown. But there's 2 lecturers that stole money, like deliberately stole money from UJ. And there's now some guy in Australia who's been caught with pornography of young people, which is pedophilia. Whenever the stories are told, we don't see the faces, we don't see the names. And I don't think the media intends to be biased. I just think it's a question of the synapses in our head, what do they say? Flying together. It's really gravitating towards the familiar and not questioning. So I would say to the media, examine your unconscious biases. And I know people think when I mention unconscious bias, I'm excusing racism, sexism, xenophobia, etc. I am not. The most difficult to fight form of bigotry is unconscious bias, because the person who holds those views is a good person who has no intention to harm anyone. But by not understanding that they might be biased, they end up being biased and being harmful.